Hello, everybody. I've kind of taken to doing lives lately just because editing is a lot of work and things have been very hectic for me lately in life. But I just wanted to share some more thoughts on the whole Charlotte Dujardin situation with the whipping video. Now that more information has unfolded, and just share some of my thoughts on that, as well as the Olympics as a whole and just reforming the horse industry in general, because I think it's a very important topic. Um, the first thing that I just wanted to talk about is that I've seen a lot of people going out of their way. Oops, it just my lives keep restarting for some reason. I'll start talking and it just restarts how long it's been on for. But hello, everybody. I've taken to doing lives more lately because it's easier for me than editing something. So I just wanted to do a quick one to share some of my thoughts on the Charlotte Dujardin situation that now that more information has come out, the Olympics as a whole, and just reforming the horse industry as a whole. The first thing that I just want to go over really briefly is that I've noticed online that a lot of people, one, are still blaming the whistleblower who made the report, two, trying to make guesses as to who made the report in the first place, and three, like not even just a guess, just like saying outright who they think did it. I want to discourage everyone from doing this because one, it puts focus on the person who made the report rather than the issue at hand. And ultimately, regardless of whether or not their intentions were malicious or not, I really don't think it matters why they decided to make the report when they did. It doesn't really change the nature of the video. But the more important thing is that when you blame random people for having made the report, you're inciting hate on those people when they may or may not have anything to do with it. I saw people the first day claiming that the woman who runs Dressage Hub was the one who made the report, which is not true. I saw people claim that the owner of the horse, I forget the lady's name, it was like Alicia something, I think, was the one who made the report. She put out a statement that she has nothing to do with it, and that she did not make the report, which of course people can lie, but like we don't know. The person who made the report is being left anonymous for a very good reason because I would say their safety is probably at risk. Um, so I think that putting focus on who blew the whistle is defeating the purpose of what this whole movement should be about, because ultimately we shouldn't be trying to play jury for why someone made a report in the first place, because there wouldn't have been a report to make if there wasn't a video in the first place. So I think that's a really important thing to say, is that we don't want to incite hate on random people who have nothing to do with it. And even if you did know for sure definitively who made the report, it's sending energy in the wrong direction, because the entire issue is that that video existed in the first place. So I just wanted to state that. The next thing that I wanted to state is that a lot of people are saying that like Charlotte Dujardin is being canceled because she's had her sponsors pull out from her and she's been suspended for 6 months and is obviously missing the Olympics. What I want to share, just like as someone who's signed sponsor contracts and has worked with different types of brands, is that these are just kind of natural consequences of breaking your contract. What you have to keep in mind is that, like, as a business, no matter how you like someone as a person, if your contract is outlining that they have to uphold certain attitudes and like fair treatment of horses, da 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 da, and they don't do that, in order to help your brand not get revenue loss because of that person's actions, you're well within your rights to terminate that contract when they don't follow the contract that you've outlined. And the vast majority of sponsor contracts pertaining to riders do have a part of them where they outline fair treatment of the horse. So I want to clarify that. I personally don't think she's going to be canceled. Like, I would be really surprised if she's not back in the show ring by next year following the 6-month ban. And it's more or less going to blow over in a way that's similar to Andreas Helgstrand, which, like, obviously a lot of people are questioning him still, and he's not as well liked as he might have been in the past. But like, let's keep in mind that there's been like Edward Gall, who's had big scandals. Oliver Townend has done some pretty shady things that have caused uproar, and then we have Andreas Helgstrand, who's done similar things too. All three of those men are still competing. And yes, there is a difference because Charlotte Dujardin is a woman. I'm not going to beat around the bush and say that she's going to get treated differently because she's a woman. I think she's being used as a scapegoat more because of the timing right before the Olympics, because she's a woman and she's just an easier target who holds less power than someone like Andreas Helgstrand does. So I'm not going to beat around the bush and pretend that she's not getting extra in terms of like the punishment that she receives compared to like a man if they did the same thing. Because like Oliver Townend flogged a horse the whip like the whole way home during cross country period of an event, and his horse was so tired that it was like crashing through fences, and he was not held accountable. But something that I think is important to note, that other people not being held fairly accountable does not mean that the way that this is being handled is unfair. It's just a sign that there needs to be fairness across the board for everyone being held accountable for what they've done, rather than some people getting away with murder and others not. Um, so I personally don't think she's getting canceled. I do get uncomfortable when I see people remarking on like what a horrible person she is and saying to like lock her away and throw away the key, because I think that fails to acknowledge the fact that we've created a culture in the horse world that has normalized this type of behavior to such a point that a lot of people are guilty of it. And if we operated with the mindset that no one can learn and grow from that, we'd have to throw out the vast majority of the horse world, especially in competitive horse sports. So I'm not personally operating with the mindset that I think she's an irredeemable person who's forever terrible. I would operate the mindset where she's not going to be one of my favorite riders who I openly support tooth and nail until she proves to me that she's going to learn from this and make necessary changes, and I can feel comfortable supporting her in that way, which I think is fair. That's just merely meeting consequences for behavior, because she's put out a very different persona publicly than what was shown in that video. So people are rightfully confused and suspicious now, and I think that's normal, and she could actually make a really positive movement out of this depending on how she chooses to handle this. um, I don't think that this will happen because it's still very taboo to do this type of thing, and it would alienate her from a lot of her peers. But if she did make the choice to speak out about the pressures of upper level competition and how normalized a lot of this treatment of horses is, and share that and talk about the internal pressures that she's felt and the shame that she felt in responding the way that she did, but talk about the fact that it's ingrained in the culture, I think that that would be really, really good for the sport, and it would show growth for her to talk about those things. But that's a really vulnerable thing to talk about, and it's going to inevitably incriminate people that are close to her that probably don't want her saying those things, because like someone in the chat is saying right now, that she's learned stuff like that from someone. It's not that she just decided to do it out of the blue, out of nowhere. She's had that type of behavior normalized to her before. So what I want to talk about is that the fixation on her single-handedly just as a person and scapegoating her and only her is missing the larger issue, because the reason why people like her get away with doing things like that is because of how normalized it is in the industry. And when we focus on only her as a person and vilify her as just the one bad guy, we're missing the fact that this is a culture that has been created in the horse world and upheld by many, many people who have taught kids how to ride from day one and normalize that level of harshness to them. And that is why we're seeing so many people who are posting things that depict horses in hyperflexion, or horses who are showing pain signals and stress signals without even realizing it and seeing no issue with it. And then when they're called out on it, it's shocking and surprising to them because they've grown so used to it that they truly do not see the problem. And then they respond really defensively accordingly. So when we miss the fact that this is an ingrained cultural issue in the horse world, we are not actually acknowledging the problem as a whole, because it's not just a handful of people, it's not just one person, it is a culture in the horse world. We have a culture of violence in the horse world that normalizes this type of treatment to a large extent. And the other part that I think really bothers me about the Charlotte Dujardin situation in particular is that there's a number of big name riders who signed a letter condemning her, and Carl Hester was one of them. I feel like it's kind of disingenuous, because also another person who signed it was Isabel Worth, who has been caught doing rollcur, and like a bunch of people who've been caught doing the same types of things basically signed this letter. And that is where I'm talking about scapegoating one person and throwing them under the bus. Is it's effectively letting other people who are just as guilty as Charlotte Dujardin is, if not more, using goat and trying to escape accountability for their own behavior because of that. Like, they're drawing the heat off of them and putting it all on her. And I think it's a really crappy thing to do, because guaranteed they would have all been friends with her before this, and they're using her as a scapegoat to try to make it look like they're taking the up and up and being better welfare. That's an incredibly shitty thing to do, because they were just like or worse. And when we let people do that, instead of looking at the culture as a whole and all of the people who are guilty of doing these bad things to horses, we are letting a lot of abusers off the hook. So like, Charlotte is just a symptom of the overall problem. She's not the problem itself, if that makes sense. And like, from what I have personally seen from how she presents herself as a person, I don't think she's like this evil, unfeeling person that people are trying to present her as. I think what she did is very bad. I'm not condoning what she did, but I think that when we look at people without nuance and look at the bad things that they've done and then choose to label them as a completely bad, irredeemable person, we miss out on the opportunity to educate people and make needed change. The horse world cannot change for the better if we do not hold out the hope that people can learn and do better than they currently are, because there are so many people who are guilty of the same things. If we operate with the mindset that they're all bad and unfixable people, then we are robbing ourselves of the opportunity of actually fixing the horse world, because we cannot just scrap it as a whole and kick out like 90% of the people who are at the top of the sport. Like, we need to work on re-educating them. And that's not going to happen if we vilify them and operate with the assumption that they can never learn and grow to do better. I think that a lot of them are going to be virtue signaling and doing things with the purpose of trying to present themselves in a way that they don't actually intend to uphold with their actions. And I think that's important to hold people accountable for that and make sure that their actions are matching their words and that they're not just saying what people want to hear. I do think that's important. So accountability is important, but we also need to leave people the room to grow. So for example, if Charlotte actually starts showing big moves that she's making changes to her horsemanship and sharing the journey of that and just like more candidly talking about these things, I think that's a positive change. And sure, it could still be virtue signaling. It could just be to bring the heat off of herself. But at the same time, it's like you don't really know which it is until you get to see a pattern of behavior. So I think that we need to look at it through that lens, because if we look at it through the lens of like scrapping all of these bad people and just going, these are write-offs of human beings and they're never going to learn how to treat horses properly, we are missing out on the opportunity of re-educating people in the way that's actually going to change the horse world. We need to maintain the hope that they're actually going to do better and that they can learn to do better. I personally believe that a lot of people at the top, like some of them might not actually like or care about the horses, and the sport might be what they actually love. And in the event that that's the case, that's why we need policy change, because if the policies written into place themselves are such that people have to behave in a more ethical manner in order to do well, then when you're operating with people who lack a conscience and lack empathy for the horses, you can hold them more accountable by making it so that they don't reap rewards if they're not willing to follow the policies in place to protect horse welfare. So that's why I'm really all about policy change, because I do think that there's some people who educating them is not going to be enough. There's a lot of really narcissistic, self-righteous people within the horse world that are going to want to maintain doing what they've always done and aren't going to want to admit that they're wrong, because it's also vulnerable to do. Even if you're not a narcissist, it's really hard to admit that you're wrong and have to deal with all the backlash that that'll bring. But you're going to get backlash anyways. So that's kind of the way that I'm viewing this from, is you're going to get backlash anyways. Admitting to your wrongs and owning them is more likely to have it blow over in the long run. And that's honestly why like I've been so open with mistakes that I've made with horses. And like that's also why I'm suggesting having more compassion towards people as a whole, and just like not necessarily condone, you don't have to condone their behavior by having compassion and opening the door for them to do better. But it's important to note that like a lot of us have done things that we regret with horses. That doesn't justify people's wrongs. And I don't think that we should use we all make mistakes as a reason to downplay the mistakes that other people make, because it's not really a mistake if you're trying to shrug it off as a non-issue. Ultimately, the way we need to look at these things is like how it impacted the horse, because horses don't know when we're acting out of a lack of education or a loss of patience. It feels the same way to them. Even if you fall off and you hold on to your reins and forget to let go and you fall off, their mouth is going to hurt the same as it would if you're just yanking on their mouth on purpose out of malice. So we need to look at it in terms of how it impacts the horse and view it from that perspective. And I also want to note, like, her being suspended for 6 months, I think that's a perfectly appropriate suspension. It seems like a lot because people are typically not held accountable at all, but it could give her the chance that she needs to kind of reflect on things and cope with the, like, learn how to navigate the emotions that you're going to be going through during this time, because it's really hard. Again, not throwing a pity parade for her and being like, oh, we should be more empathetic towards her than the horses, because like those actions impact horses. And like that's the other thing to note, is the fact that she's been caught doing that stuff and that it's been publicized. Go look at the number of people defending her behavior outright. In her letter, she condemned her behavior herself, whether it's just to save face or not, who cares. She condemned the behavior, but she's still having tons of people who are justifying her behavior and trying to downplay the severity of it. And that is why it's so dangerous to have these role models who do these things, because it leads to other people justifying their own misbehavior, and it trickles down and it normalizes mistreatment of animals on a broader scale than just at the upper levels, because there's support groups being made for her to basically say that she shouldn't have been barred from the Olympics and that she shouldn't be getting held accountable for what she did because it's an older video. I've heard rumors that the video is only 2 years old. I don't know if that's true. Regardless of whether it's 2 or 4 years old, I don't really think it matters, because at the end of the day, it is not a good look. Again, like, I've been very open about how I was brought up to handle horses. If I had more of my lessons filmed as a kid, there would have been videos of me like yanking on their mouths and like spanking them with whips when they don't go into a corner that they're afraid of or whatever, because that's what my instructors told me to do. And if those videos got leaked, it would be a bad look. But I don't do those things anymore. And if I were to have something like that come out, the way in which, like, and again, this is easy to do because I'm not going through that level of spotlight that she is as an international rider. But if it were to happen to me, it would be through the lens of not calling it an isolated. I've already admitted that, like, the way that I had been taught to train horses prior was like, it was an isolated occurrence. There might be some isolated occurrences in other circumstances and reacted in a more hyperinflated way. But the culture of hitting horses for misbehavior and getting after them in that harsh manner was something I had ingrained into me. So it was a repeated occurrence. It wasn't just a one-off thing. And I think that's also something that's really important to note. Getting to the point where you can hit a horse that many times, I don't think is like a one-off occurrence, unless it's like that's a one-off occurrence, as in that's the first time I've hit them that many times. But you get comfortable with hitting them to lesser extents, and then when you do lose your patience or whatever, more can come out and you can act out of character in terms of doing more than what you would on any given day. But the point is that it's a culture that people have learned where they're desensitized to the pain that they're causing horses. Because I used to not bat an eye with like the bits and equipment that I would put on the horses that I worked with. I didn't even consider the fact that like yanking on their mouth or like riding in a twisted wire snaffle that's really thin, that the reason why they were more responsive in it was because it was causing them more pain. The thought literally didn't even cross my mind because it was never presented to me by my role models. And it's one of those things where when you're looking at it in hindsight, you can go, that's common sense. And yes, it should be common sense, but what we need to like it, and especially when you go into those atmospheres as a child, you don't have the same perspective that you do as an adult. Kids do not have the same perspective to question the things that are happening. And on top of that, when you're going throughout your whole childhood having these types of things normalized to you, even as you do start to develop the brain capacity to have that perspective, it's a lot harder to question all of these things that you've had normalized to you for years, and it requires a lot of inner work, and it's really scary, and it also generally alienates you from the community that you've been brought up in. So choosing to walk a different path in horsemanship means like losing a lot of friends and losing the barns that you ride if that's what they've normalized, and it's a big loss, and a lot of people that loss is so big that it's harder to leave. For me, I think that if I hadn't gone through so much trauma early on in childhood, it would have been easier for me to leave earlier. But the stress of having to navigate all the wrongs that I had committed to horses and how much I had learned incorrectly was so much to take on with all the other trauma that I was dealing with. And that, again, this is not an excuse. It's just like an explanation of the timeline for when I started seriously reflecting on my behavior and what I had learned. And a lot of it involved a change in environment. So when I moved out of show barns and I went to pleasure riding barns and I was around people who did not prioritize competing, it exposed me to a different type of mindset that started me on this reflective path of considering the way that I'd done things. And that was really instrumental in unlearning stuff, or like the start of the process of unlearning stuff, because it's a multi-year process. There's so many layers that you're having to peel back and unlearn. So like initially my unlearning process started with seeing how much of an impact actually providing horses with adequate turnout provided, like how much of an impact it made to their behavior. And that was something that I couldn't unsee. So then I became a huge advocate for turning horses out in groups. And that was like the first major change. And then from there, I started to use less and less equipment where I wasn't using twisted wire bits anymore. And then I went to not using gag bits or pelhams, etc. And I slowly weaned myself off of those types of equipment, like draw reins, martingales, etc. And then it kind of snowballed from there. But it's like peeling an onion where you're peeling back layer after layer, and it takes a while to get to the core of the issue. issue. And honestly, like for me, I'm still unlearning stuff, and I'm still having to really work on things, because it gets easier the further along you go. But initially, when you're dealing with having been enabled and encouraged in taking your frustration out on horses, there's a lot of emotional control that you need to learn, and there's a lot of emotional frustration that you need to unlearn. And it takes time, because you have to get to an emotional state where you're less likely to be reactive, and that takes a lot of practice. And it generally involves pulling yourself out of situations that you cannot act right in, instead of continuing to follow the, oh, make them work through it mentality. So it's a really big process. And again, I don't think that it helps to coddle people during this process. Like, I think the people who approached me and were like, "Oh, what you did was not that bad. Like, everyone makes mistakes. It's no big deal. We all lose our patience. They're a big animal. They barely feel it." That type of attitude prolongs the amount of time it took me to unlearn those things, because it taught me that what I was doing was less bad than it was. So I don't think we should coddle people and worry about the person's feelings more than the horse's. I don't think that means that we have to be nasty to them and be like, "You suck. You're the worst person ever. You're a villain. You're the most evil person I've ever met." You don't need to say stuff like that, but you don't need to coddle them. You could be like, "Look, that was bad. You lost your patience. That was not helpful at all for your horse. And I believe you can do better than that." So you can take things through the lens of like looking at your idols and going, even when they make mistakes, and going, "I think they are better than this. And I believe in their capacity to do better, but that was not it." And I think that's the lens that people should approach it through. It doesn't mean you need to cancel and write off every single person who ever makes a mistake, but you got to look at the degree of the mistake, whether or not it's been repeated a bunch, and whether or not their behavior seems to be changed, and operate accordingly. Because that's why, like for me, with trying to change the horse world, I do believe in people's capacity to change and do better, because I was able to do it myself, and I was really entrenched in the type of mindsets that I now speak out against. And I would have been the type of person to be defending stuff like what we're seeing now with this Dujardin situation. If you looked back like 10 years ago, when I was like graduating high school and stuff, I would have been more likely to defend her and err on the side of that. Like, that's not that bad. That's not fair. This is a witch hunt. Um, but my perspective has since changed, because I've recognized like all of these factors that led me to not being able to make the changes that I've made as soon as I could. And there's a lot of moving parts, because there's stuff that's going on outside of people's lives with horses that impacts their behavior with horses. When you're having a really big struggle mentally or physically or whatever outside of horses all of the time, your span for like being able to maintain your emotional regulation is going to be less. Again, not an excuse. Having trauma does not justify taking out that trauma on animals, but it explains why people are more reactive to those types of things. So I think that the way to look at this is that like we're trying to fix a systemic issue. It's ingrained in our industry. The way competitions are set up encourages people to rush and get impatient and try to fill quotas and timelines that aren't fair to the horses. And it encourages a certain type of behavior because of how competitions are functioned, what gets normalized to us in the show ring, what gets normalized to us in lesson barns, all, even like stuff like the animal husbandry. The amount of horses who don't have their needs met and are responding dangerously as a result is used to justify the harshness that people handle them with, despite the fact that what's actually causing the issue is the mistreatment of the horse and like the not having their needs properly met. So we need to look at all of that, because if you address the animal husbandry, a lot of the problems that people use to justify their treatment of horses would no longer exist. So if we start to fix those issues, it's going to kind of like pull the threads loose and make it easier to fix the rest of them. So that like it's just like such a complex issue. And I think that we need to look at it from a systemic basis, because also like a lot of the show horses that people struggle with and justify this harsh use of equipment, they are difficult to handle because of their needs not being met. A lot of them don't get social turnout. A lot of them don't get much in the way of turnout at all. That's something that Dujardin and Carl and Hester did well. They turned their horses out, and they were big advocates for turnout. But the important thing to note with that is that advocating for one good thing doesn't undo other bad things that you do. It's all connected. It's all interconnected. So we need to look at the whole issue as an entirety. The other thing is with the Olympics, we're seeing a lot of photos coming out from the warm-up rings where horses are being hyperflexed and being ridden in unfavorable manners. And we're also seeing photos from the jogs that show horses who have a lot of muscular atrophy and other things. And people don't see that problem. They don't see it for what it is. They've been taught to view it as normal. And because of how prevalent those types of things are, they don't see it as an issue and they just turn a blind eye to it. So then when it's brought to their attention, they're usually very defensive and they kind of double down on that mindset, even when it's not serving them in the long run. And if they were to make the adjustments, they'd have sounder horses who are more capable of performing. So it's a complete re-education, because we have people who are not necessarily defending all of these bad things out of a lack of care for the horses. They've just been taught to care for them in the wrong way. And what they view to be the right and best way to care for horses is not actually that. So in order to make these big changes, we need to look at it as an industry-wide systemic issue, and also look within ourselves at our own mistakes and how we were misled and taught incorrectly. Because like when I started riding, I was 4 years old. You know, like when you're being taught to do things as like a 4-year-old, like you don't know the difference between right or wrong. Adults are teaching you that. So when we have adults that are teaching these youngsters wrong things that they then take with them into adulthood, and then they become trainers who are teaching kids the same types of things, it's a lot harder to unlearn the further you go down that path and the more you are in the horse world, especially once you start to train and like be a professional or ride at a higher level. It's been normalized to you for so long that it's really hard to see your way out. So unlearning it is a lot harder than just learning things differently from the beginning. And if we start to make these systemic changes, it opens the door for people to learn things differently right from the beginning. And that's my hope for the horse world. So it's not about viewing it as like where people can't make any mistakes and where they're always bad. Like I think the degree of mistakes should impact how likely you think they are to change. So if someone like freaking like Andy Kocher shocking a horse with electric spurs, that is a pretty calculated, awful thing to do. Coupled with like the other stuff that he like the equipment that he used, etc. So like the standards that someone would have to have in order to like buy back their public perspective and faith when they do something that bad and like that consistently, probably higher than if someone actually has a one-off occurrence or like a lesser instance of abuse. But at the end of the day, it's like all in the same thing. Like regardless of the severity of abuse, these types of attitudes are all in the same type of thinking. And it's just the degree to which people have had that level of abuse normalized and how much harshness they've had normalized. And they'll also change depending on what industry you're in. So there's certain types of abuses that are more normal with certain types of disciplines and less normal with others. But at the end of the day, the attitude behind all of them is largely very similar. So in order to make change, we need to look at the system as a whole and work to change that system rather than fixating on one specific person or a handful of people. We can use those people to further the cause, but the entire mindset behind it should be with the attitude of like, we want to make systemic industry-wide change rather than fixating on a handful of people. Charlotte Dujardin is just one person, and she is certainly not the most guilty or the only one who's done something like that. She's just the one that has gotten caught right now, but there's a ton of other people who are doing the same things. And if we want to protect the horses, we need to fix the mindset that results in them doing those things. And it's one that is taught from a young age. And not all these people are bad, evil people. They're just doing what they've been taught and what they've had normalized to them. And there's a mass miseducation on horse behavior and stress and how horses think and feel about things. So it's like a complete re-education needed. And if we start from the top down, I think that's a good way to have people start to make changes, because a lot of people look up to upper level riders and copy what they do. And also their instructors will also model those riders. So looking at the top is, I think, important because they have the most influence. It's not to say that like abuses at the lower levels don't matter, because they absolutely do. But like we model role models at the top. And when we have people who are being told to the entire world that these are the best riders in the industry, we need to look at that and go, like actually take in the amount of damage that does when people are looking at someone that they've been told is the best rider in the world doing something really sketchy and then going, oh, well, if they do it, it must be okay. And it's the same thing. I've seen a lot of people justify the way that these competition horses with muscular atrophy are looking by being like, oh, well, they're at the Olympics, they have to be properly conditioned. There's this mindset that if you make it to that level, that you must be doing the right thing and that there's no way it could be wrong. And we need to erase that mindset, because currently you do not have to be ethical to climb up the levels. That's not how the system works. Olympics. If the system changes to prioritize ethics above all else and horse welfare above all else, that might be the way it is one day. That's the way it should be. I don't disagree with people on that, but it's not the way it is currently. So using whether or not someone makes it to the top, whether or not they're at the Olympics, whether or not the horse passed the jog and gets into the Olympics as a basis of how ethical the training and treatment of the horse is not a good standard to set. We have to set unbiased standards that are not rooted in status and someone's ability to get to the top levels, because you don't have to be doing things ethically to get there. Anyways, I have to go, so I just wanted to say that very quickly and just share my thoughts on those things. I'll leave this live up for replays for people who want to see it. Check out my Facebook page, Milestone Equestrian. Been posting lots of updates on there, and also Instagram, SDEQUUS. You can check all that out and just follow along for like what's shared. If you see anything that you think needs coverage from the Olympics or otherwise, feel free to reach out to me by email or message, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. I'm not going to really be able to watch much in the way of the Olympics tomorrow because I'm going to be busy all day. So if people are watching it live and capture stuff that they think needs to be talked about, sending it my way is really helpful. I'm going to do my best, but tomorrow in particular is going to be a rough day to do because I have my whole family visiting right now. So anyways, have a great day, everyone, and best of luck doing your horsey things and navigating the state of the horse world right now, because it's definitely very difficult. But keep in mind, you don't have to be the worst version of yourself forever. You can do better. Doing bad things to horses for a time can be a lesson that you learn how to do better, and then use the skeletons in your closet to help other people feel more uncomfortable clearing out their closets and doing things better. And that's why I try to share a lot about what I was taught to do, because it is very traumatic and I found it to be healing to share that with you guys. So anyways, thank you. Have a good day. Bye.